political party ActionSA says it believes the DA's mayor in Tshwane, Randall Williams, is the reason they're having problems with their coalition in that city. Earlier this week, ActionSA voted against a proposal by the DA to accept a contract with private companies to refurbish 2 power stations in the city to help end load shedding there. ActionSA says the contract came from an unsolicited bid and that city officials opposed the move. The DA says Williams has done nothing wrong and is simply trying to end load shedding there. Just to remind you, these are 2 parties who are in the same coalition. You would think they're supposed to be friends. They're not behaving like it. Michael Beaumont is the National Chair of ActionSA. Michael, thanks for coming in. Good afternoon.
Absolutely, and thank you. And just one small correction, if I can, Stephen. Coalition partners mustn't be friends. We actually think this kind of tension within a coalition is important because we need to hold each other to account. And if it wasn't for the fact that Tshwane was run by coalition, the residents of Tshwane would have had this decision foisted on them by a majority party.
Okay, I'm going to come to that because the relationship between you and the DA is very interesting. Sure. You say this is all about the actions of Randall Williams, but surely he's doing the right thing to try and end load shedding in the city. Someone comes with a solution to a major problem, don't you accept the solution?
Look, ending load shedding is something that every South African can get behind, including ActionSA. We are all for efforts that improve our supply of electricity and reduce our dependence on Eskom. Eskom has let us down. But the process in which we go about that needs to ensure that it is going to be successful, that it is legal, and it is done in a manner that's going to produce the best result at the lowest cost to the residents. And I'm afraid in all 3 of those regards, this particular proposal was found wanting.
Is there a better way to end load shedding in Tshwane than this?
Absolutely. I think firstly, you've got to have a legal proposal. What we have here is highly questionable. It's being put forward as an unsolicited bid. This is not a sole provider. There are many companies that provide this kind of electricity. And if we go out on a competitive process, what you can find is competition generating the best result, the best outcomes at the lowest possible cost to the residents of Tshwane. And there should be no reason to be opposed to that.
It seems to me odd, on your version, that Randall Williams would go against any of that he would have any kind of corrupt intent here. I mean, certainly you haven't claimed that. So, I mean, it seems to me all he's trying to do, perhaps, is just fix a problem. Someone's come with a solution, so implement it as quickly as possible. You know, the DA's argument against you is that this is around him and Mashaba's ego. I'm not sure where that comes from. But the fact is that if there's a solution on the table and you can start work on it now, and with the best will in the world, it's still years away from being implemented, well, work should start.
Well, let's look at it right away then. So this particular proposal is an unsolicited bid from a company. It's been driven through the political office of the executive mayor. That's firstly highly irregular. Secondly, it is believed that the service provider in question does not have a NERSA-approved license to produce electricity. So when we talk about this being some panacea to independent power production, there's some major questions around that. But as you move down the investigation into this process, it is not even confirmed yet at what price this provider is going to provide electricity. And in this recording that has gone around with senior officials raising their opposition to this particular proposal to the mayor, their view is it's going to be more expensive than Eskom electricity. And these issues collectively make it highly dubious that this is going to achieve the outcomes, the good outcomes, of ending load shedding in Tshwane.
So you say this is about Randall Williams, it's not about the coalition, it's not about the DA. Do you want him to be removed as mayor?
I think it's premature to make that judgment. We certainly have major question marks about his ability to lead this municipality. But as an organization, we aren't going to impose our view arrogantly on the rest of the coalition. Our view is that is what has gotten us here. We are going to approach the multi-party coalition with our concerns, with the evidence that we have collected, and we're going to say we have genuine concerns about this individual's ability to do the job. But from an ActionSA standpoint, we remain absolutely committed to multi-party coalition, and we are committed to making sure that we keep the ANC out of these municipalities.
It's a very complicated thing. I mean, there's several very complicated things in coalitions, and one of them is trust. So now Randall Williams has to lead this coalition. I accept what you've said. But he has to lead it knowing that the people in his coalition, that he can trust them. Otherwise, he can't have any conversation around governance. At some point, he's going to have to come to you with financial proposals to pass a budget. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart. Can he still trust you?
Well, I think the actions of ActionSA have always been in the interest of the residents of Tshwane, and we've been consistent about that. If Randall Williams brings us proposals that are consulted upon in terms of multi-party coalition, and those proposals are legal, and they are good for the residents of Tshwane, then he will absolutely have our support, as he has on many occasions up until now. But this particular occasion, a proposal was brought that in our opinion is illegal, and when ActionSA said we will not support this item for the following reasons, the response is, well, we'll do it with or without you. And at that stage, they began briefing the ANC and the EFF to secure their support for these items.
I mean, in the end, it all goes back to this issue of trust. You pointed out, you wanted to correct my introduction. That's fine, you have that right to say that people in coalitions shouldn't necessarily be friends. But, I mean, most people who are friends trust each other. Trust is an element of friendship, and one tends to flow from another. So this gets to the relationship. How do you see the relationship then going forward? Can the DA trust you in, I mean, what happens in Tshwane is probably going to affect Ekurhuleni, probably going to affect Joburg going forward. I understand that you and the DA both don't want to let the ANC back in, but if you can't work and trust each other in all of these metros, the whole thing's going to fall apart.
Well, firstly, I think we like to compartmentalize these arrangements. There are individual coalition agreements in place for each municipality. And as far as we're concerned, in Johannesburg, the Mayor of Johannesburg and the Mayors of Ekurhuleni are working with ActionSA in a number of these regards, and we have no problem. Joburg has announced its plans for independent power production, and there's been no opposition from ActionSA. This is a Tshwane problem, and it's a Randall Williams problem. And if the DA is willing to engage us on that level and find solutions, they will find people who are interested in serving the residents of Tshwane.
Do you have any councillors in the city of Cape Town?
No, we didn't contest Cape Town in 2021. But we are now expanding into all 9 provinces across South Africa and setting up our structures so that we can contest every province in 2024.
I'm intrigued that, so we spoke to Bongani Baloyi, of course you'll know him, the Gauteng chair, earlier this week about it after the vote. You had the vote, and then today you have a whole big press conference about it. You must feel very strongly about this one particular issue.
Absolutely. It's a very big issue. And I think we need to understand, Stephen, that in multi-party coalition, we cannot have a dynamic where being a coalition partner means you just go along with whatever. We have displaced ANC governments in metros with multi-party coalitions, firstly in the 2016 term and again in 2021. And what is hugely important is for the multi-party coalition to demonstrate we are different to the ANC. And if multi-party coalition means that as a coalition partner we must just support a proposal regardless of its potential illegality, then ActionSA didn't sign up for that kind of a coalition.
It's interesting you say that you need to show as a multi-party coalition that you're different from the ANC. I think in electoral politics that must be correct. It's also correct that you and the Democratic Alliance are probably competing in a similar pool of voters. Not entirely, but you're probably competing both in the pool of voters of people who no longer want to vote for the ANC or never did, right? It's a very big pool of people. Are you using this to try and differentiate yourself? It seems to me that all opposition parties are actually going to battle to differentiate themselves, especially if they're in coalitions, as you are. Is this all about differentiating yourself from the DA to show to this pool of voters they should vote for you instead of the DA?
No, I think we must be clear about this, Stephen. This is about serving the residents of Tshwane. And we will be unapologetic in our stance in doing so, because we need to do what is right by them. But are we aware that this is differentiating us from other political parties? Absolutely. And it'll be for the residents of South Africa to determine whether they regard this differentiation to be a positive one or not.
So, I mean, in some ways, you and the ANC, excuse me, I'll take that back. You don't call each other comrade in ActionSA, I notice. No. You and the DA have quite a lot in common in certain ways. You go for roughly a middle-class vote, not necessarily, there are changes to that. You're also both sort of anti-ANC, you both refuse to be in a coalition with the EFF, for example. It seems to me that actually it's going to be quite hard for voters to differentiate between the two of you on some of your major policy platforms. You're both free markets. You're both, if I remember correctly, not for affirmative action or black economic empowerment. So in other words, you've got to work quite hard to show you're different to each other.
Look, I think any emerging political party has to work to claim its political space in the policy sphere in South Africa. I think actually there's enormous differences. You speak about free market, for example. And while an uncompetitive, unsolicited bid is not a free market system at all. But we think there's a number of areas where we are different from each of the major political parties. We are undergoing the development of our national policy suite right now, ahead of the 2024 elections. And we are confident that that will demonstrate some fundamental differences. But I always like to say, Stephen, that a lot is paid about the question of policy differences, and rightly so. Policy is very important. But equally important has to be how political parties conduct themselves. Because if you look at policy, the ANC stands against corruption. Is that consistent with what goes on in government? I don't think so. And that is why it's very important that South Africans are looking at these proceedings to say, how are these political parties using our votes to govern and to serve our interests?
It's interesting you talk about corruption. There was a big press conference yesterday of most of the opposition parties, all the opposition parties represented in Parliament, apart from 4 of them for various reasons. This was all about Phala Phala. Now, you're not in Parliament, so obviously you weren't invited. Nothing you can do about that. But do you support the actions of those political parties to try and bring, on their version, to bring more accountability from the President over Phala Phala?
Absolutely. I think there has to be accountability here. And we have seen all too often in national government how the instruments of the state are used to protect political leaders, and we cannot have this take place once again. If you look at the evidence before South Africans in this matter, there's patently the question of the law being broken, and there needs to be accountability mechanisms to make sure that there is actually going to be consequences for that.
Obviously, you can't take part in the actions in Parliament. You can take part in public protests. There may be one planned for next week. The EFF will be there. I'm not sure if the DA will be. The UDM certainly will be. If you're invited, will you go?
We'd have to consider it. We actually haven't heard of this particular protest yet, but we certainly would consider how we would approach it. But I think from a principled standpoint, holding the President to account for this particular issue is an important one that we would support.
Michael Beaumont, thank you very much indeed for coming in. National Chair of ActionSA. Plenty to come, I think, on the issue of Tshwane. In other news, the